an associate professor and executive director of the Environmental Law Center at the University of Victoria. She focuses on the subjects of water and regional watershed sustainability, and she's the author of the Green Bylaws Toolkit and many other documents, and has extensive experience in regulatory approaches to conservation in the province. So we're really happy you braved the interior winter storm from where I'm sure there's flowers in Victoria to come and join us today. Thank you. I'm just going to make it so that you can use the clicker.
Okay, thank you. I'm a little shorter, so I get to stand closer to the
And you can see
microphone.
where you, oh, so this lands better on you.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone. I'm happy, very happy to be back in the Kootenays, and I have to admit the drive this morning wasn't that different than what we've had in Victoria this winter. It's just that the drivers are much better here, and there are also lots more 4x4s. So while you wouldn't brave Victoria streets with 2 inches of snow because people really don't know what they're doing, it's much safer to get around here when there's a little bit of snow. I'm always struck when I come here at in the density of organizations that are working on different issues. So sometimes in Victoria, we feel we're a little bit overrun with environmental organizations and others, but I truly think because of your physical geography, you have many more organizations who then, it obviously necessitates that you work in partnership. And I think that that is really the approach, and ultimately what I come around to talking about when we talk about local government jurisdiction, and what I've talked about for 20 years, that the jurisdiction, the legal part of it has changed very little in the last 20 years in terms of what you can do around conservation. But the approach has changed quite significantly in terms of the partnership between nonprofit organizations, sometimes senior level of government, and then local governments to actually bring about these large scale and long-term conservation objectives. I just want to say one more thing about partnerships. It's you mentioned plastics as one of your next things you're going to be working on in the Environmental Law Center. Put forward worked with a couple of MPs to put forward the motion that was recently passed federally as unanimous motion around ocean plastics. So it's kind of fun to see this, sort of cross Canada initiatives that are ultimately end up working. And I also think this is a little bit of my focus as well, is that everything that we do here, whether you're a scientist or a nonprofit organization or you administer a conservation fund, you're actually not going to get very far unless you get broad scale buy-in, or a buy-in of a certain amount of individuals, and in the local government sense, it's property owners and residents, and then also your local government elected officials. So I'm pleased to be speaking to a large number of elected officials here today, which is often rare. I'm often speaking with planners who are younger than I am, and have a lot of good ideas and interest in implementing things. So I'd also like to echo the territorial acknowledge the Ktunaxa and the Sinixt peoples whose traditional territory we're gathered, and also more broadly the other Indigenous communities here in the Okanagan, so the Secwepemc and the Okanagan peoples. I wanted to just start with a few contextual statements, and then I'll jump right into the bylaws. And I'm hoping to do this in a non-boring way, and that I'll leave that up to you whether that works or not. It's not very interesting for us to go through, here's OCPs, what can OCPs do for conservation? Here's zoning, what can zoning do? So what I've tried to do is talk about more the approaches or the policy approaches that then bylaws will always fit in under. So there's just a couple of contextual pieces to that. The first one being water, which is obviously what often drives this landscape very much, and as Juliette pointed out, is a very important piece, because where do we all want to live and where do we want to produce our food? It's in those ecologically sensitive valley bottoms that have a high demand for development in a variety of different ways. What we're seeing is, in particular with local governments, because they are on the front lines of flood and drought, meaning if there's not enough water, the people for whom they are water purveyors are complaining to them. If there's flooding, they have to react right away, because it's often on roadways. So local governments are really at the forefront of emergency management and in dealing with water. So too much water, not enough water. And we see this in particular in the Okanagan, as you know, over the last few years. Very telling from an emergency management perspective back in 2012 when the city of Kelowna had 3 200-year storm events in the span of 2 weeks in the Mission Creek watershed, right? So if you use the 200-year sort of baseline as what you're balancing all of your engineering decisions and your other infrastructure investment decisions off of, it gets blown out of the water when we start thinking about climate change, and in particular, the water effects of climate change. So really, what I'd like to do is, throughout this entire presentation, I really only want to leave you with 4 messages. And you'll need to trust me. I can say this. I'm a member of the Law Society of British Columbia, so as much as you believe your lawyers, we have all the legal tools that we need to achieve virtually all of the conservation goals that we want to achieve on the private land base that local governments administer. So for me, this is not a legal problem. This is very much a political will and a citizen understanding of what it means or what the importance of conservation is across the landscape. So the first is that we need a nested approach to conservation. And what I mean by that is that no individual property owner is going to accept regulation, meaning riparian regulation or requirements not to develop on certain parts of their property, unless they understand themselves and their property to be part of a much bigger initiative around conservation. And therefore, then they are willing to take that impact on themselves because they understand what the long-term and the landscape level goals are, and they see that happening around them. And that's the only way individual site-specific or property-specific regulation will be accepted ultimately at the end of the day. So that gets me to my second point around we need to stop reverting to this discussion about property rights, which we actually don't really have in Canada, because we have a high degree of regulatory tolerance is the way the courts see it. But it's really about ecological health and how do we achieve that, not only on the crown landscape, but on the private landscape as well. We all have a role in conservation, and sometimes conservation isn't just voluntary, but it's actually regulatory, because it's the regulatory aspect of conservation puts in place those long-term landscape level plans. The third one, which makes, and in particular makes local governments uncomfortable, is that we need to have more performance-based standards in our bylaws. So I would even say in our official community plans. So everyone treats OCPs as policies and they set nice general direction. They don't have to do that. You can be much more specific. You could say, like the regional growth strategy does of the Capital Regional District, 95% of new development will occur within the urban growth boundary. 95%. And they measure that, and they then that ramps out to the official community plans, not only the regional district OCPs, but also the municipal official community plans as well. A very, very successful growth management approach that the resort municipality of Whistler has had, and none of us really want to use Whistler as an example of the way that we do development, but they had a bed cap. They've had a bed cap since the 1980s. And so they say we are capped out on the total volume of beds that we have in Whistler. And if you want more, you have to provide they have a formula. If you want more than those beds, you have to provide employee housing. And in that way, they managed to actually house 95% of employees in Whistler, or 95% of people who work in Whistler are housed in Whistler. And it's because in part of that bed cap. So it's worked out very well for them long term. So having measurable performance targets could be around biodiversity, could be around ecosystem services, could be around percentage of land base in a conservation zone. So the District of Highlands, I'll show you one of their maps, and their goal is to have 80%, they have it written in the OCP, 80% of our landscape will be in a conservation holding. Finally, I think we, for the last 10 years, or 15 years, we've been focused a lot on mapping and getting more data to justify our bylaws and the designation of conservation areas. And I think we have enough data, and I'll give you a sort of the bad story of the District of Saanich that did away with its upland development permit areas. I'll give you a little bit of that story. And that's where I draw this conclusion: we have enough data. Obviously, we need more data in certain areas, but we have enough data to act. Local governments do not need perfect lines drawn in the landscape in order to act. So you can go with more broad ecosystem features and that kind of thing in order to actually get the regulatory framework in place. So lack of mapping or data should not be a reason for us not to go ahead with the regulatory framework anyway. This is taken from the old Green Bylaws toolkit. You can tell because the Local Government Act still has the old section numbers, but this is just to show you we have a huge number of legal tools already. And if we really put these to use in creative ways, we would do everything that we want to do on the landscape with a few exceptions. And so this really is a conversation about what are the packages that you put together as a local government working in partnership with conservation and other organizations to make conservation land on the ground. So the first thing I'm going to talk about, and that'll be the bulk of my discussion, is sort of an integrated ecological health approach. So I'll walk us through kind of 5 principles, I guess, and then I'll show you the way different local governments have put bylaw packages together to achieve those principles. Then I'll spend just a few minutes on what happened in Saanich, because I think it's really instructive for all of us, and the arguments that were put forward in Saanich to do away with the upland development permit area, I think are very familiar to all of us, and why that perhaps happened is a useful lesson to all of us. And then finally, just pointing to some other priorities, and again, this goes to our nested approach, that it's less about the regulation and the laws. Those are important. They provide the ground rules, but it's much more about what is your long-term culture of conservation for your local government in the way that you see yourselves. How is that expressed? What kind of work are you doing on the ground or doing in partnership with conservation organizations such that you don't lose the social license for the regulatory baseline? And what I mean by that is, you know, we change over time. So if we change over a 20-year period as a society or as a community, what is it that you're doing to maintain the support for those conservation regulations? So it's not just you put the regulations in place and okay, we're done. Because as we see with Saanich, who has had EDPAs for 20 years, then they got rid of it because they hadn't kept up with the public facing aspect of, we are a community of nature, right? That was very much part of the ethos of Saanich back then. Okay, just in looking at an integrated approach to conservation, the 5 things I'm going to deal with are designating biodiversity corridors, containing the urban footprint, so growth boundaries, enhancing the green infrastructure, clustering development, and protecting important areas. So the first around designating biodiversity corridors, and we can certainly look to the Okanagan, and Scott will talk about it a little bit later around their conservation strategy. Individual land conservation always needs to be nested within a broader sense of what are we actually doing across the landscape. So we've kind of gone beyond the era of parks, just doing parks and protected areas, and we understand from an ecological perspective that corridors and connectivity are as important as actually protecting landscape. And in most of our local governments, that landscape is fragmented with private land, and therefore they need to be an important piece of private land, need to be an important part of biodiversity corridors or conservation corridors. So typically you would start at a regional growth strategy level, and if you don't have that, then you would start at a sort of a multi-partner regional conservation strategy level. This is a map from the Capital Regional District regional growth strategy, but what it sets out is the green-blue spaces system. This was agreed to, this green-blue spaces system was agreed to before the RGS even came about, by the conservation organizations, most of the land trusts, and the Regional District Parks Department, because they wanted to coordinate on priority lands for acquisition. So they did the green-blue spaces strategy to identify those important corridors and then the unprotected lands and where regulation and other things were needed. And therefore that was then the basis or formed the policy basis for the regional growth strategy. So likewise here, I know you have a lot going on in the Kootenays around shared priorities, and that those shared priorities around connectivity and acquisitions can then filter into official community plans as well, and can provide the ecological baseline for any land use decisions that are made. The other thing is that, as I mentioned with the Capital Regional District Regional Growth Strategy, we have a metric in there around having 95% of new development within the urban growth boundary. So obviously the RGS sets out the urban growth boundary like an official community plan could do. And then there are very specific policies around how that new development will be located within already serviced areas. And that's typically what we're talking about with urban growth boundaries, is you simply delimit an area to which servicing will be provided. It's important to have those metrics, because if you don't, as a community, even in an official community plan, how do you know you're achieving the goals that you've set for yourself? OCPs, I love them to death, and they also drive me crazy, because they're very, very few of them actually, when you go to revise them or to update them, very, very few of them ever have an ability to look back on what you've done and then to say, did we achieve, or are we on the way to achieving a healthy community? And I put that broad statement, a healthy community, out there because no one would disagree with me that we don't want healthy communities. That's exactly what we're doing in our public life or in public service. So what are those things for your communities around transportation, around conservation, and there's lots of other areas in which you can have around housing that you can have specific metrics that you measure. The final thing I wanted to mention, and I'm not going to go into it into a lot of detail, but you can ask me questions if you're interested, I guess, because we're in Creston too, which has a lot of agricultural land. While you can't regulate the zoning or the use of agricultural land, a lot of local governments have have a little bit of confusion around the way in which the ALR fits in with local government jurisdiction. And there's actually a lot local governments can do. So it's not just that it's hands-off ALR. From a conservation perspective, environmental development permit areas could apply to ag land. There's nothing that prevents them from doing that. It's just that no local government has ever done that, and the province would certainly tell you that you can't. So zoning, you obviously can't zone ALR for other uses, but there's a lot of other ways around parking and different things that you can engage with it. A couple of examples of conservation strategies. Surrey has a biodiversity conservation strategy. The Comox Valley has a conservation strategy called Nature Without Borders, and they are systematically working with local governments to put in place the appropriate zoning and environmental development permit areas that flow out of that conservation strategy. So the Surrey's was done by the City of Surrey. The Comox was done by the Land Trust. And then this is the biodiversity conservation strategy for the Okanagan, which Scott will talk about further. The second principle then, so we have sort of a landscape level, large scale strategy that identifies connectivity. Then we go to growth boundaries. These can be, as I've mentioned, in the regional growth strategies or official community plans, and they're quite simple. They usually, all they do is talk about where services will be put, and then that relates to then zoning. So I think in communities that are more rural, you could be a little bit more fine-grained about where lot size, they would reflect specifically on the kind of lot sizes that will occur. So here in the regional growth strategy of the capital region where I live, you can very clearly see kind of that brown area, which is the urban growth area. So there will only be servicing provided within that area, and there will be no extensions outside of that, except upon a 5-year review of the regional growth strategy, which then elicits a public conversation. So the servicing policies around the growth boundaries are very much supported by zoning. So you keep, you know, rural zoning should always be relatively large lot and then allowing more density close in. And, you know, I would argue if I could do anything for conservation, if someone said, what's your one thing you would do for conservation? This is what I would do. And the reason is because having large scale connectivity outside of developed areas is legally a much simpler way of providing that landscape level, just even openness, than trying to fiddle around with where development will go on a particular property to maintain ecosystem values. So once you get down to the site specific level, it's a lot more work and a lot more resources and energy for local governments to fiddle around with, well, let's cluster the development on this site over here and then we'll protect this 20-meter corridor, rather than having a growth boundary that simply says, look, it's appropriate to have development here and it's not appropriate for it to be outside of it. This is the Saanich, the district of Saanich where I live has actually had an urban growth boundary based on servicing limits, because they simply didn't want to put in pumps for sewer and water. They've had it since 1968. So I'd argue it's one of the, well, it is one of the oldest in North America, if not the oldest. And you can very clearly see the line where the urban growth boundary is. So on this side is rural and that side is urban or suburban. And it's just along Wilkinson Road. So along one side it is serviced and the other side it's not serviced. So this permeates all of their policies. It's established in their official community plan. And they have made a commitment that there will be no alteration of the urban growth boundary without a referendum. So it's been seen as so important for the community that it's not a decision that councillors, I guess, ultimately at the end of the day, who passed the OCP, felt it was something that should simply be left up to the council table, but that it should be a broader community conversation. The third area that broadly you can do, with which you can do a package of bylaws, is around enhancing the green infrastructure. And I appreciate the riparian areas regulation doesn't apply in much of the Kootenays. For the Columbia Shuswap and for other local government jurisdictions, it's a very good baseline for conservation. So it's a provincial level baseline for private lands. And it's so much easier for local governments to simply point to the province and say, I'm sorry, the provincial government has told us to do this, and therefore you have to do it. So for those other regional districts and municipalities that aren't subject to it, you'd need to be establishing your own environmental development permit areas for riparian areas. When you do it yourself, obviously you designate those corridors however you want. In the riparian areas regulation, there's a default mechanism, and I would encourage all local governments to exceed the riparian areas regulation, because then you're able to much better plug into consultants' reports and actually achieve the outcomes that you want. I feel like we've been saying the same thing for 20 years, and so it's important to now grab onto this. Riparian corridors are the beginning, they are the foundation of connectivity in any community. And so they should simply be protected. And I'm not a scientist, but everything that I understand and have read in the last 20 years simply points to that. And so it's a little bit of no-brainer now that we should simply be protecting riparian corridors, and then also not just doing conservation, but also doing restoration within corridors. So although you can do this through zoning, in my view, the best way to protect riparian corridors is through environmental development permit areas. And I promise you, this is well, actually, I take you through two sections, but anyway, this is the only time you're gonna get one of those slides that is entirely unacceptable in that it's got too many words on it. But for all of you local government officials and you planners, go back to the office and look at section 491(1) of the Local Government Act, because it is really remarkable what you can do pursuant to this section. If you designate an environmental development permit area, you can do all these things. You can say land must remain free of development. You say it has to be preserved. You can make restoration requirements. You can require natural watercourses to be dedicated. You can require works to be constructed, restoration. You can plant or retain vegetation to preserve and protect and restore fish habitat. So it provides us with, it really is before its time, in my view, when it was put into the Local Government Act. And no other jurisdiction in Canada allows local governments to do this in this way. So it really is, especially with the ability to require restoration, it really provides a very comprehensive tool for implementing at a site-specific scale all of those landscape level commitments to corridor and connectivity that you've made first through planning and partnerships. And then this is partly through zoning and through EDPAs. This is then how it lands. I'm going to go through this. This looks a little bit longer than it's going to be. It's only going to be 2 minutes. What I wanted to just say is 2 years ago, I reviewed all of the case law on development permit areas in British Columbia. And there hasn't been a single development permit regime enacted by a local government that has been tossed out by the courts. So basically, local governments are doing it right. Where you get the pushback is, of course, from citizens who don't want to be restricted in where they build their new house or what they do on their landscape. But I just wanted to bring out or tease out a few of the principles just to reassure you that what we know about development permit areas, in particular environmental development permit areas, is right, and we can do that. So the question is not legal. The question is then working through and in partnership with your citizens to understand the broader landscape level goals that you're achieving, of which the implementation of development permit areas is only one way of doing that. So the first is the law does not require specificity on the landscape about what is in the EDPA and what is not. Like, you don't have to know exactly where the line is on the ground. A broad zone of risk is entirely acceptable. So a general sense of the kinds of ecosystems or the area that is included is entirely fine. You don't have to have real specificity. The second thing is that guidelines don't have to be specific either. So in your OCP, you designate DPA guidelines. They have to simply give direction to the landowner as to how they're able to develop their property. So that it doesn't have to be precise, it can be broadly defined so that you retain your flexibility as a local government and your discretion to implement permit conditions on a case-by-case basis. EDPAs can be used, or environmental development permit areas can be used to implement connectivity. So although your lawyers in the firms in Vancouver and Victoria don't like to do that, certainly Whistler has asked them to do that, and some other local governments. And so you can implement connectivity both through zoning and what we understand about the way in which zoning works, but also through environmental development permit areas. Likewise, EDPAs can designate environmentally sensitive areas even if it's on private land. So you can have prohibitions around development, you can have buffer zones, you can create development footprints on specific properties away from ecologically sensitive areas. And this is the approach of the Central Okanagan Regional District, where they blanketed virtually their entire landscape with an environmental development permit area. And it's a bit onerous to get a DP permit. So they have a specific terms of reference for an ecological assessment and those kinds of things, such that generally people in rural areas will choose to simply not develop in the EDPA. So if the EDPA is blanketed in particular around water courses and willow copses and those kinds of very sensitive areas, people simply choose to build outside of them. And then they don't get caught by the development permit net, I guess. As I mentioned, you can have restoration and enhancement requirements as part of your development permitting. It can be a usual permitting condition, and then you can also have site and watershed assessment. You can incorporate best practices standards into your guidelines, but courts don't like it when you just simply say, you know, we incorporate the entire green bylaws toolkit into our environmental development permit area guidelines. That's not specific enough. They want you to provide specific direction for landowners, and so you have to be a little bit more careful in the way in which you're doing that. And then finally, you can't just require as part of your development permitting process information from an applicant. Often local governments will just simply say, well, now we would like you to look at, you know, where the skink are on your property, do an assessment. You actually have to have a development approval information area bylaw. And so that is a separate process. So the only reason I mention it is just because I still come upon local governments who just regularly ask for information, but they have no legal basis to do that unless they have passed a development approval information area bylaw. Okay, the second to last principle would be then to cluster development. And this relates then also to, you know, on a larger watershed scale, this relates to growth boundaries. But this is in particular with your subdivision policies to make sure that development either on a particular site or when you're doing a subdivision is clustered away from ecologically sensitive areas. And you can obviously have extensive policies for clustering in your official community plans and around subdivision as well. So, you know, Nanaimo, which has for many years been the fastest growing municipality, sort of slips from between number 1, 2, and 3 in British Columbia. They use clustering policies in their official community plan as well as environmental development permit areas for subdivisions to get extensive clustering. So if there's any wetland on a property, you can't build on it, but you can maintain the density of what would have occurred on that property, but you simply cluster it on the rest of it. So you'll regularly see, for example, a 200-acre subdivision, 50 acres of wetland, and then there'll be clustering on, you know, sort of 130 acres with a buffer zone around the wetland on the rest of it. For municipalities, there's other regulatory bylaws. I mean, regional districts too, but it's a little bit more constrained around tree bylaws and that kind of thing. But you have another layer of regulatory bylaws like tree bylaws to support your environmental development permit areas, which we know are challenging, a bit more challenging to enforce. But if you have a tree bylaw layered over top of that, then it's easier to issue tickets under that. And the final thing I'll just say is around security. Lots of local government, as a regular part of issuing development permits, always take security for restoration and for ecological impact, which they will then keep for 2 years or up to 2 years, and then will give it back to the developer or the landowner if, in fact, the permit conditions were held. So it just becomes a regular part of the way they do business and changes sort of the culture of what you're requiring for conservation. The final thing is, the final principle is to protect important areas forever, and that's around the federal and provincial governments working with land trusts and others to actually conserve landscapes as parks and through land trust acquisition. Okay, just a couple of minutes. Can you tell me, do I have 5 minutes left? 2 minutes? Yeah. Okay. 15 minutes left. Plus questions or 15 minutes total? Okay. So I'd just like to go into what happened in the District of Saanich, just because I think it is very instructive for all of us who are interested in conservation and are interested in putting in place some regulatory tools for conservation about what can happen when we don't have the full package of sort of a nested approach to conservation. The Saanich has always been one of the municipalities in British Columbia that is at the forefront of ecological protection. So even before we had the riparian areas regulation, they had mapped all of their waterways. They had looked at providing setbacks. They had done a whole bunch of different kinds of things. And so when the riparian areas regulation came in, they put in environmental development permit areas, but they made it easy, what they called easy for their citizens, in that they actually mapped out what were the SPIAs, or the assessment areas. And they said, look, landowners, you can either accept our setbacks in our assessment areas, or you can hire your own professional and get them to do it. And what landowners found very quickly was that the Saanich SPIAs were entirely reasonable, and then therefore landowners didn't need to, or developers didn't need to actually pay money to their own qualified professionals to do the assessment. So there was Saanich kind of went above and beyond in facilitating not only conservation, but the ability of their citizens to interact with these regulations. In 2012, then they, and after having done a lot of mapping, they have a sensitive ecosystems atlas that is specific to Saanich. They then extended the environmental development permit areas to uplands areas, so sensitive ecosystems in upland areas, or non-riparian, I should say. It's probably because a lot of it was waterfront, was ocean waterfront. Now, this only affected some slightly more than 2,000 properties, and it was about 2% of the properties in Saanich, so not a significant number. Then in 2016, people started to speak out against the environmental development permit area, specifically the non-riparian one. So there was lots of media attention. There was a particular retired biologist who took issue with this, did a 60-page report detailing why the upland EDPA, or the non-riparian EDPA, was ridiculous and was imprecise, was based on faulty mapping, and had a disparate impact on those property owners, who then trotted out a number of property owners who said that they had lost, for example, $100,000 value in their home because it was designated in this environmental development permit area, or $2 million on their property because it was designated in this EDPA. We then get a new mayor and some council members. They struck a public process. There were 4 town hall meetings where several hundred people spoke. Lots of criticism of staff, which was remarkable to watch, remarkable in not a very pleasant way to watch. A lot of discussion about a taking of property rights, so that the local government had taken away property rights from these residents, and the unfairness of this application of this environmental regulation to these few properties. And so I stand here and I should just tell you, my home was in the environmental development permit area. So so I too apparently had the same impacts on my property. Saanich hired a land assessor consultant, who then did an assessment of the way in which the EDPA had affected property values, and it was found to be virtually none, if not none. So not only did BC Assessment do a report and found that there was no disparate impact, but then Paul Rollo, the consultant, also found that there was not an impact from evaluating this program. The biologist who had been very critical was sanctioned. Actually, the decision just came down a few months ago. He was sanctioned by the College of Biologists for acting in a conflict of interest, because while he was actively campaigning to do away with the environmental development permit area in non-riparian areas, he was also representing landowners who were applying to remove their lands from the EDPA, so he was getting a financial benefit. And he was found to have spoken unprofessionally and otherwise, I don't want to use the word slander, but unprofessionally towards other biologists, meaning the staff, Saanich staff who were biologists, and what he said about them and the way in which they exercised their discretion as professional biologists. So the council did roll back or do away with the non-riparian EDPA last year, and this was one of the signs, the lawn signs that lots of people had on their lawns. And so, what are some of the lessons learned? So you have a municipality that's very dedicated to ecological protection. They've done a lot of background information around mapping and getting the scientific data in place in order to do these legal designations. And then we have the huge public outcry and a rollback. So what do we learn from that? The first one is And this goes back to one of my primary messages for today is we have enough information. You don't have to provide perfect mapping or information. You simply have to provide a zone of risk. So an inordinate amount of the conversation at these town hall meetings and in the public was, the line on my property goes right through my garage, This is false. This is bad regulation, and it is not, it's false. And so when you get stuck in those conversations on a site-specific basis, you then lose the entire purpose of why the EDPA was established in the first place. It was part of a Saanich-wide, in fact, a region-wide sensitive ecosystem protection and connectivity strategy. But when you start pointing to lines on a map going through your garage, and you say that this is invalid and you can't trust this regulation. So in my view, less mapping, more zones of risk, and all of the other, or the 5 other EDPA programs that we surveyed in the province, so the city of Kelowna, Central Okanagan Regional District, Nanaimo, they just blanket the landscape with environmental development permit areas. So you know you're in it because everybody's in it. And then they have exceptions to that. So that's through the exceptions that people don't have to apply for a development permit. The second one is around staff discussion and guidelines. So in your guidelines, although they can be very general, it's really helpful to provide more goalposts, especially around restoration. So if you have an actual guideline that says generally, we will require 2-to-1 restoration for disturbed sites. And then you can define what 2-to-1 means, or 5-to-1 in the case of riparian habitat. So you can define those things, and Saanich didn't have that. And so they felt that if they had had a little bit more direction in the guidelines, then people wouldn't have taken issue as much with staff discretion. The third point, and what, again, one of my take homes is it has to be nested within a broader landscape or region-wide conservation strategy or conservation sense of who we are, so that I know on my property, when half of my property is in an environmental development permit area and I can't build whatever it is I want to build there, that in fact it's meeting these larger goals that we've agreed to as a region. Most local governments focus on the Conservation Act aspect of environmental development permit areas, so trying to protect certain landscapes from being developed on. I think we need to use it a lot more for restoration. Sure, you can build there, as in build over there, but we also want you to restore this riparian ecosystem that maybe you didn't do, but we shouldn't have lawns right down to the lake. Like, that's no longer acceptable. We want you to replant willow and other kinds of riparian vegetation and restore that area. And then finally, again, nested within a broader culture of conservation, and whatever that means for you as a local government. You can't just pass a regulation and say, yay, we did it, and that's a win, and then we're going to go off into the sunset, because people change and the impacts on properties change over time. And so what is the local government in partnership with conservation organizations doing to maintain that support for that regulation ultimately? Okay, final comments. I'm just going to mention 2 things. So the first is that we will increasingly link growth management and conservation to risk, because conservation actually decreases our flood and drought risk. And we're going to, I think, just from a dollars and cents and an infrastructure planning perspective, local governments are going to do that much more directly over the next 20 years as we see more extreme storm events. So if we start thinking in that way, it provides an additional motivation for conservation. An example of this is the city of Kelowna has what they call the Mission Creek, I think it's the Restoration Fund. And what they do is when they have an impact in Mission Creek, meaning like under the Federal Fisheries Act, a HAD or an impact on fish, they put money out of Kelowna coffers into the fund, and they then purchase land adjacent to the creek and they renaturalize it, because they know in that highly urbanized corridor, which is subject to extreme flooding now, they're never going to be able to do flood control in the way that development has occurred in the last 50 years. So it's only through renaturalization, through buying properties and renaturalizing them, that they're going to be able to mitigate some of the flood risk. The final thing I'll mention, and it is my favorite section in all of the Local Government Act, is that we have to recall that when we have an impact on people's properties from a regulatory perspective, if we decrease their value, their property values, which, as I point out, is largely not the case, but that's typically what comes up. People equate regulation with decreased property values. We simply do not need to compensate them for that loss of value in British Columbia and in Canada in general. Unless you zone their property as parkland, so they can't use it for anything but a public use, you do not need to compensate them for zoning designations, for OCP designations. It's a very broad exemption, and I can say that there isn't a single local government land use regulation in Canada that has ever attracted compensation. So there have been some federal and provincial regulations that have, but there has never been a single local government regulation. And that is all. Please have a look at the Green Bylaws Toolkit. The new one is up, but I went to greenbylaws.ca the other day and it took me to a stewardship center non-site. So I put in the request to make sure that it comes back up. So if you go to it in the next few days and it's not there, be assured that I will make sure that it reappears. Thank you all. I'm happy to take the question.
So we have lots of time for questions, but I just want to mention to the folks online that if they have a question, you can type it into the chat box and Nicole will speak it out for you. Thanks.
Yes, absolutely. Oh yeah, sure. So the question is an environmental development permit area strengthened with zoning? So my view, and I'm happy for everyone to disagree with me or for folks to disagree with me. My view is EDPA comes after, a regional strategy where you have urban containment, where you have connectivity corridors that are then embedded in OCPs. So aside from the planning and the strategy, the actual bylaws themselves, so zoning and then environmental development permit area is not really a bylaw, but that designation, the regulation, subdivision, tree bylaws, those are all the other smaller site-specific tools that get at this broader vision of who we are as ourselves and this broader notion of connectivity across the landscape. So I think zoning comes before EDPAs. Again, I don't want to put it out there as what comes first, because sometimes you'll be more successful in getting environmental development permit areas in certain areas designated rather than redoing your zoning bylaw. I mean, whoever does that, right? And zoning is very controversial. So it might be easier to just designate some riparian EDPAs, for example, in some areas than redo zoning. But absolutely, they strengthen one another, providing this nested, layered approach to achieving a vision of health for our communities. Yeah.
They're asking online if the question asker can
Well, it's going to take more
time. My question was EDPA guidelines. You said they can be quite broad. Do you have some examples of terms of reference to guide QEPs on how to meet the objective? And maybe we can talk about that offline.
Sure.
And last question is, you didn't go over the tax exemptions and covenants in one of your slides. I was just curious about that.
Don't I need that for people to hear me? This is why it's going to be inefficient. So I'll speak the question. Oh,
It's not okay. She asked.
So the ones that I always point to, the terms of reference, are the Central Okanagan Regional District. So they have a terms of reference for QEPs. And what I love about those ones in particular is that they say a QEP who has experience in the Okanagan. So they're very explicitly linking the expertise with the ecosystem in which that QEP will be operating. And I'm sure there are other ones, so we can chat about that. Your final question, the reason I gloss over, and all the land trust people are gonna just throw darts at me when I say this, the reason I gloss over covenants and the tax exemptions is they are so much work and they're quite expensive, and they then apply to very few properties. And so there is absolutely, just like zoning, just like EDPs, there's a role for all of these things, but they're much more site specific. And so how they then work, like for lots of subdivisions, a covenant would be appropriate. If you're clustering development, then you want to have and it could be a bare land strata, and then you want to put a covenant, or you want to require a covenant on the remainder in favor of a conservation organization. So there are very specific examples of why that's important, but I don't see the promise of tax exemptions as driving any conservation. So Gibson's is the only local government that I know of that has done a riparian tax exemption. They did it for a specific reach of one of their creeks. And it took so much work, and then it has to be designated on an annual basis, and to get the consensus of all of the owners, and one of them was a strata, et cetera, took just so much work. So it might be that it is a more appropriate role, for example, for a conservation organization to go out there and do the public outreach and to get the consensus of a group of landowners who then come to the local government and say, okay, we have agreement, we would now like you to do a tax exemption bylaw, and then whether or not it works. But I just, and I could be selling local government short, but just in my conception of your resources for doing this kind of work, in terms of bang for your buck, covenants are good in a regulatory sense, but not telling everyone that, oh, come and we'll do a covenant, or come and we'll do a covenant. That just doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
Quite a few questions, I think.
I think it's faster if people just tell me, and then I'll speak into
so
it.
Elaine and Gary, and then Arnold, and then Jerry.
Just quickly, as a former mayor and board member of the RDPK, connectivity corridors are on a landscape level mapping designation potentially. So what do you say, first question, what do you say to a landowner that sees they're being designated a connectivity corridor for wildlife on the planet and don't want to be designated because it could impact if they want to do that? Secondly,
So let me just say, so the first is about connectivity corridors. What do you say to a landowner who sees that their property might be designated in that corridor and they don't want to be, because it could impact what they can do with that land?
the second one is, what do you say to mayors or council who say, look, any development, good development in my community, and things like smart growth principle and the development of areas great down on the coast, but they don't really apply here.
Yeah, so the second question, which is directly related to the first, I think, is what do you tell mayors and councils who say that all development is good development? And smart growth principles, where you're really dealing with urbanizing environments, are great on the coast and in rapidly developing areas, but for our communities, they have no applicability. I very much take as the starting point for the conversation about local government jurisdiction and ecological health, the principle that we can all agree that we want healthy communities. Like, that is, in whatever way we achieve that, that's what we're doing here together. We want to maintain healthy communities, and a very important part of that is a healthy environment. So you might then say, well, look around you. I mean, the environment is all around us. We have a very a small part of the landscape that is privatized. The challenge, though, is that the part that's privatized, as Juliet showed so well, is that it is those very ecologically important valley bottoms where we want to farm, and where our wetlands are, and where we want to live, because they have high recreational values. And so while the answer isn't easy, nor is it a short-term conversation in terms of me replying to your question, But I would pull out all those studies that show that all development is not good development. So there's lots of studies around what kind of development actually brings in the kind of tax dollars that pay for themselves. And sort of, you know, depending on, a lot of residential development simply doesn't pay for itself. So if you're building for tourists, for example, there are many, many scenarios in which the tax dollars that you bring in do not pay for themselves in terms of your long-term infrastructure budget as a local government. And then, you know, I can't answer that question for you in terms of all growth is good growth. I simply encourage you to say, who do we want to be in 50 years? And then how do we get there? And that's a little bit more directive. That allows you to be internally directive rather than simply accepting forces from outside doing it to you in that sense. Because I think that some folks in the East Kootenays or in the Columbia would say that perhaps if they'd had a little bit of a different vision, things would have happened a bit differently. And I certainly know in some of the coastal communities that if they had had a more strong sense of how is it that we want to be in the future, that it might not have played out that well. It's a very imprecise answer to you. So I leave it to you guys to have that conversation more than me with my legal head.
I'll go to Gary. I know you're trying to get to the
I might be able to project enough that might fix it up. Good growth is only good if you track the outcome through the development. You mentioned an information area bylaw. I tried a decade ago to get our previous development manager to do this. 2 reasons. Tell people what we know and to require them to tell us what they're doing. So if they're working through Ministry of Environment or Interior Health or consultants, it's a requirement for occupancy out of the building. They need to give us the results of their development. Lake discharge without any kind of treatment, those kind of issues. We need to know what's happening in the environment. If an information bylaw be used to collect that kind of information, in addition to providing information to developers or landowners?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. So the question is, could you use a development approval information bylaw to get information from the developers after the fact? So after they've developed, whether that development is actually having the kind of impact that you anticipate. So I haven't looked at that provision recently, but my sense of it is no. The development approval information areas can be used to get information during the development permitting process, and permitting I mean more broadly. So when you get an application, you can then say, or you can say in your guidelines for applications, we need these studies or this kind of information. But you could do that as a permit condition. So as part of your development permit areas, meaning environmental development permit areas or for commercial development or whatever you designate them for, you could have a permit condition that there is information provided after the fact or throughout in order to then, for the local government to better assess the outcome of that particular development permit or that development process. Now, lawyers have this sense we could push this, but lawyers have a sense that, especially for security, you can keep it for about 2 years. Like, what's reasonable? What's a reasonable amount of time to say, has this development worked, or did the restoration work? And the sense is it's around 2 years. So my comment would be that if you're going to require additional information post development, you might have kind of a 2-year window in which to do that.
Of course, many developers don't finish ever some of their obligations.
And that's why you want to take security, right? So that then you simply finish it, or you get someone else to finish it.
We're getting low on time, so one last question. Okay, great.
This is more of a comment than a question. Michael Proctor,
So Michael Proctor works hard and he obtains much land for a Riparian corridor through the valley. Soon after that, private landlord comes along and rules on the connected area between his corridor and the natural habitat or the winter habitat of grizzly bear, We are not regulating private land logging nearly enough. We used to have a forest practices code that did that. As a group, we need to pressure the provincial government, come up with our own bylaws to protect areas that private land loggers are ruling.
There are 2 law reform proposals right now around private managed forest land out there, as in 2 projects that are developing. So this is on the radar of a number of organizations because it is continually a problem. I hear more about it from a water perspective, so drinking water contamination perspective than from the connectivity perspective.
And then Jerry and Sherry.
No, I'll pass. Okay.
Okay, and then Ramona.
Thank you. My question also was about private land logging and development. So having an area that chose by ballot not to have a community plan in half of it. I do have development permits in the other half, but currently private land logging has created quite a stir. And private managed forest land is one thing, but people pull it out and there's no notification to local government. And so sitting with this dilemma at the moment, I'm wondering how broadly you can apply development permits once you do have an OCP in place. That wouldn't be restrictive to people doing real estate development necessarily. So it's a complex issue, and private land logging that is not in the private managed forest land base is really the issue.
Are you hinting that you would get support for land use regulation in that other half if it didn't affect real estate development? So we had an interesting example in the Capital Regional District about a decade ago. And what happened was there was a number of parcels of land that were privately held, but they were in a tree farm license, and then they were taken out. And the zoning that was in place at that time was insufficient. So it was 5-acre lots or something. So the CRD quickly put in a 300-hectare zone, but there was some, compensation and other things that were required just in the way it was a very strange and unique kind of scenario. So you could very clearly have regulations in place for land that is only in private managed forest, and then limit, as in you could simply do it through zoning, and then limit what occurs, and then not have it on the rest of the landscape, or write your zoning in a way that applies to the entire landscape, but requires any new development to come forward, at least for a conversation, to the regional district board. So you can, you might not use private managed forest as the descriptor in the zoning bylaw, but it could be overlaid on what you know to be the private managed forest. You could do environmental development, you could do development permit areas, but it that doesn't make much sense because it's more the use of the property that you're trying to get at. We can chat more at lunch.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.